The Super Bowl is here, so bet with MyBookie. Use promo code Gators and get a 50% match with your first deposit. Only at MyBookie.
Gators Breakdown. Because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And it's the same lineup from last week. We had our offensive preview last week for the 2021 Gators, and we'll fast forward for an early preview for the defense this week. Joining me, as it did last week, is Will Miles and his site, readandreaction.com. You can find him on Twitter at Will Miles SEC, and also Nick Knudsen from American Football Stories. Guys, got some pretty good feedback for the offense last week.
Yeah, well, that's the encouraging side of the ball. So now we get to the side that everybody's a little bit pensive about. So we'll see whether people still like us at the end of this one, because I think there's some good news, think there's some bad news, but obviously it's good to talk about. It's early, right? We probably still got some guys who might be coming in to help. So not exactly who everybody hoped, but the staff changes that we've seen are interesting to talk about, and we'll see what everybody thinks.
Yeah, Nick, we'll get into it for sure, but probably the highlight, and we'll get into all of it too, for sure. Transfers, new hires, and that's what we'll be getting into on this episode.
Yeah, and like Will said too last week, pleasant thoughts about the offense. Here's our anger episode where we can maybe not anger, maybe we can put a positive slant on it for some stretches. It can't get any worse than 21. That's the good part about looking ahead with the defense. But
oh my, how many times do we say that about the Florida offense under Will Muschamp?
and you know what,
Doug Nussmeier.
And if you keep saying something, you're eventually right. So just keep saying it. So I think that this could be a little cathartic too.
Yeah, I think so too. We'll get into it, but before we do, announcement for this Thursday. I'll be in Gainesville for come together pretty quick here, but a speaking engagement for the Fighting Gator Touchdown Club will be at the Fairfield Inn and Suite starting at 7 p.m. So come join us for an evening of talking Florida Gators football with the Fighting Gator Touchdown Club. That's in Gainesville at the Fairfield Inn at 7 p.m. Before we get to the meat of the episode, remember you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. You'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes there, as well as News4Jax coverage of the Gators. Help us out. Please share, rate, and review the show on YouTube. Hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button. Really helps us out. Live on YouTube, you'll notice the new Super Chat feature here on Gators Breakdown for donation. It'll highlight your comment for everyone in the chat to see, and if you do so, I'll post it on the stream as well, as long as it's supportive and pertinent to the topic. No cussing, of course. Can't share that here on the podcast. If you just want the audio version, check us out on your favorite podcast platform and follow Gators Breakdown on social media. We're on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Guys, let's start up front. Defensive tackle, we'll start there because that's been the position that's been hit pretty well as far as the transfer portal goes for the Gators. And getting some much-needed help, of course, on the interior in the form of transfers. Antonio Shelton from Penn State, Daquan Newkirk from Auburn, some much-needed proven production at the defensive tackle spot after Kyrie Campbell and Daryl Slayton move on. Get the pair of these guys with Gervon Dexter, the five-star freshman that should be a pretty good rotation between the three bodies there. Add in Jalen Humphreys, Jalen Lee, Lamar Goods as players you hope to see more from in 2021. The depth looks better than it did when the 2020 season was over, getting those two transfers in. The biggest thing for me is with that number and getting the players like Shelton and Kirk in the fold, it allows other players to play their natural positions. And we said that many times last year, and especially the beginning of 2020, was Zach Carter, Brenton Cox playing out of position. Carter was playing inside instead of defensive end. Cox was playing defensive end instead of standing up on the edge. So not only do you get guys that can play their positions and have experience elsewhere doing so, helps the entire defensive front and getting better players staying in the better players staying in their positions. And then adding signees, Desmond Watson, Christopher Thomas as well. And I want to bring up Watson because there's no one else at the position like him. Even though he's a true freshman, early enrollee, most labeled him as an underrated prospect with his size, but he brings that plug ability. And he'll need to lose some of that bad weight coming in, so he'll be one of the more important pieces to get Nick savaged. But here we go. Going back to the transfers right quick. Newkirk, Shelton. Newkirk, transfers from Auburn, and 2020 was pretty much his first full season after he had 2 prior Achilles injuries. 6'3", 317. Quick little nugget. He also played running back in high school. That's a scary thought. Went the JUCO route first. Started 9 games for Auburn last year, 28 tackles, 3 for a loss, 6 tackles in the game versus Tennessee last year. He'll be a nice piece in the rotation that can play, some defensive end and bigger packages if they need him to. Antonio Shelton started 21 games dating back to 2019 for Penn State, 31 tackles, 8.5 for loss, and 4 sacks along the way in his starts. In 9 games this past season, he secured a career best 4.5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, and 2.5 during the final 2 games for Penn State. Known as an emotional presence for Penn State on the defensive front. He was their hype man, getting his teammates hyped up before games. 6'2", 327 pounds, appeared in 40 Nittany Lion games following a redshirt 2016 season, and finished his career at Happy Valley with 51 tackles, 12.5 for loss, 6 sacks. Played a lot of football, best suited for holding up blockers that have helped Florida's linebackers. Will, a whole lot there at defensive tackle that when Florida walked out of Dallas in the Cotton Bowl, wasn't too sure we'd have these 2 guys on there, and they were very, very, very much needed.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I think the thing that gets overlooked in terms of the defense not being able to stop anybody through the air last year is they couldn't stop anybody on the ground either. So when you look at yards per rush allowed, they ranked 81st in the country. They were 88th in yards per pass allowed. So it was really kind of equal opportunity, futility. And actually, when you look back at 2018, Florida ranked 52nd in yards per rush allowed and then 13th in 2019. And when you look at that 2019 roster, the thing you notice is 2 things, I suppose. One is that you had Kyrie Campbell and Adam Schuler, who really stepped up to be big time starters, 68 total tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. And when you look at Newkirk and you look at Shelton last year's production, you're at 42 tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, and 5 sacks. So not exactly the same as Campbell and Schuler a couple years ago, but you're approaching that. And when you combine that with Gervon Dexter, who last year had 20 tackles, 2 for loss, and 0.5 sack, I do think you start to approximate a team that's going to be able to at least hold its own up front. And maybe you don't get to that, top 15 ranking in terms of yards per rush allowed, but you do get back into that, 30, 40, 50th ranking, which allows you to have a defense that's at least serviceable. I mean, the thing is that the linebackers oftentimes got eaten up because the defensive players couldn't hold their end, because the defensive line couldn't hold up their end of the bargain. You mentioned guys playing out of position. That's one of the things that I think Shelton and Newkirk bring is allowing Zach Carter and Brenton Cox to play their natural positions. But it's not just like they're plugging a hole, right? It does look like they've got some skill. They've put up some stats other places. And then, when you think about the defensive line, Dylan Meeks, who's a defensive end from Akron, is also coming into the fold as a walk-on. And I know people are going to sleep on him a little bit, but 47 tackles last year with a tackle for loss and 0.5 sack. So he's used to playing Division I football. Or that was 2019. He sat out 2020. But
Dante Lane got moved from offense tight end to defensive line. So believe me, having a guy from Akron, I'm not going to sneeze at that. I will take that over Dante Lane switching sides of the ball to get some reps.
Well, we'll probably see that too, because they still need. That's the thing, right? Is even with the transfers, if the guys who they've recruited don't step up, they're still going to be thin. So it's great that they have these 2 defensive tackles in. I think these are guys who are going to contribute, but it is part of the worrying trend of having to continue to plug holes through the transfer portal, and you hope to see some of the younger guys step up and really compete for playing time, and not just allow Newkirk to come in and have the starting job right next to Dexter. You really hope that you see the young guys really push and potentially even displace these guys because, they're transferring in. These other guys have been on the system for a little bit longer. You'd like to see the transfers get pushed and everybody get better because of it.
Nick, man, yeah, I've been going into to last year and looking at it. Gervon Dexter, I mean, look, he was the prize recruit of the class. So no surprise that he got the most playing time out of the true freshmen. But, there weren't a lot of true freshmen on the team, especially on the offensive side of the ball. You were so experienced there. You didn't really expect it. But, a lot of true freshmen, because of missing spring, because of not a normal offseason, you didn't see a lot of freshmen get a lot of playing time. Gervon Dexter, definitely him being the 5-star, you would have liked to see, hey, if this 5-star could have got the normal offseason, the normal Nick Savage, everything that goes through a normal spring and a normal fall camp, how much better he would have been. Look, to me, he played as probably one of his better games, if not best game, versus Alabama in the SEC championship game. And don't get me wrong, I know Alabama scored pretty much at will, but still, there were things you could pick out if you really wanted to against one of the best offenses in the country. But going to Will's point, you got to be strong up front. We want to see Gervon Dexter take that next step, but also those guys that didn't get a lot of playing time underneath him last year, Lee, Humphreys, those guys, we're going to have to hear their name before the season's over with.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, Dexter is the guy to absolutely circle because he is going to be the star of this team. If everything progresses as planned, he's going to be the star of this team. He's already got NFL size. And it's like you said, it's extra impressive what he did last season. I know he didn't necessarily jump out entirely throughout the year, but it's extra impressive considering all the COVID issues they had where maybe the guy's working out from home with just a workout sheet from the Gators for most, until he gets on campus or something like that. So I'd like to see him develop and grow. It's going to be great seeing him get a full off season, full amount of work. We interviewed on the American Football Stories podcast. We interviewed Kevin Kelly in October. And he said one of the biggest issues with his team, he's a high school coach out in Arkansas, the one that never punts. One of the biggest issues with his team was the defensive side of the ball. It was absolutely more effective than the offensive side with all the COVID regulations and not being able to hit and everything. And I know at the beginning of the season, we wanted to think that was the main issue with the defense, but we really saw problems at all levels of this defense. So it would be nice if we can at least get a point of the defense that we could really rely on this year. And that's why I think the transfers of Newkirk, Shelton, and I was going to bring up Meeks too, because Meeks is not a guy. None of these guys are big stat guys. You're not going to see him show up with sacks, a ton of sacks or anything, but they're going to help clog up the middle and let some of these great athletes we have run to the ball and get there. And really, if Dexter develops the way he's supposed to, he's going to be that monster in the middle anyway.
Yeah, you're not going to get the stats from these guys. It's going to allow Ventrell Miller and Diabate and Cox. It's going to allow those guys to get the stats. If those guys have good stats, you can probably point to up the middle being the reason or some of the reason those guys get some good stats. And while we're talking about and bringing those guys up, we'll go to the next grouping, and the group that benefits from these transfers, as I said earlier, Zachary Carter being able to come back and hopefully play a big majority of his time and with his hand in the dirt at defensive end. It'll only help him and help the Gators there. Brenton Cox will be standing up off the edge. We'll look for him to take that next step and becoming a more well-rounded, more consistent threat on the edge. Jeremiah Moon's coming back for another year. It sounds like he's finally found a new foot doctor that can treat what's been a nagging injury for him the last couple of years with his foot. Then add in players that we saw flashes from last year, Chatfield, Bogle, Mullen, Summerall, Antoine Powell, and the Gators certainly won't, have to force in new signees, Tyreek Sapp and Justice Boone into roles next season. We say we saw some good and potential in those players. Spring can really help those guys separate a bit from each other, but the three I'll probably point to, and we saw make some plays last year, Chatfield, Bogle, Mullen. I know in limited time it was late in games. Those are the ones to me that can help, push the starters, carve out roles for themselves. As long as the season progresses there's a lot of speed there. But these are the guys that need Nick Savage more than anybody on the team right now. There's a lot of speed there, but normal strength and conditioning the most. Florida got pushed around a bit, going to Will's point, got pushed around a bit in the trenches last season. The physicality wasn't necessarily there with any consistency. A lot of speed, but the mentality needs to change. And look, I think Mullen knows that with this group. I think it starts with them getting that little nasty streak and kind of just getting back to what we saw the last few years for these guys getting into the backfield and harassing quarterbacks.
Yeah, Bogle was the guy who really flashed to me. He was the guy who they started Jeremiah Moon most of the first half of the year, and he struggled, right? He struggled in coverage. He struggled getting to the quarterback. The minute they started subbing in Bogle, things got better. They got better pass rush, particularly, I was thinking about the game against Vanderbilt, I believe. They were really struggling to stop Vandy, which says something about the defense, but they were really struggling to stop Vandy. And Bogle is the guy who came in and really started to help Cox on the other side start to put some pressure on the defense. But the issue is that when you had Bogle in there, you could run right at him, and he was too young or too small, and the offensive lineman could push him back. So that's really going to be sort of the like I would really love to see this defense at some point, especially on third downs, mimic the New York Giants in those years where they terrorized the Patriots, where you've got four guys, you take a larger defensive end and shift him into the inside. All that stuff that Zachary Carter learned last year about going inside on third down should really help him terrorize the quarterback. If guys like if guys like Bogle and guys like Summerall and guys like Mullen can really take a step up and start to really pressure off the edge. There's some talent there. And so you're right, Dave. I mean, the reality is that if those guys get a little bit stronger and can hold up against the run, then it'll make a big difference in terms of their ability to really sort of free up those linebackers to make plays. But it all still sort of filters back to those defensive tackles, right? Being able to occupy a double team, which allows Cox, allows Moon, allows Mullen, allows anybody who's out there, Chatfield, to have one-on-one on the outside, because you wound up with Cox and Carter were guys you had to double team last year and really nobody else. And so in critical situations, Florida struggled to get pressure with their front four. And we'll see. I mean, I think a little bit of enhanced strength this year really should be able to help them get pressure with their front four, have more than one guy who can occupy a double team, which means you're going to get some one-on-one matchups. And then when you bring the blitzing that Grantham likes to do, it won't just be an easy pickup because the running back will have to make a choice. Or if there's no running back, you'll have a free runner at the quarterback. And we didn't see that a lot last year. We saw it where, oftentimes the offensive line was able to take the defensive lineman one-on-one, allowing an offensive lineman then to pick up the blitz, and then Florida couldn't get there, and then the secondary got picked apart.
Nick, we talked recruiting here a good bit and the importance of it. And Florida had a five-star in Brenton Cox. Mm-hmm. Looking back a little bit, how would you grade what you saw from him? Was it too critical because he has that five-star status on him, and again the transfer from Georgia, probably not as consistent as the season that we've wanted to. We kind of mentioned the beginning here of playing out of position, especially toward the beginning of the season when Kyrie Campbell was out, having to play more defensive end than he probably wanted to. But to me, he's going to have to be the leader of these guys to bring it all together and be that force of a Ja'Kai Polite and Jonathan Grenard and Jabari Zuniga that we've seen in these past years under Todd Grantham.
Well, Cox definitely jumps out. The athletic ability's there. I mean, even was McShay on a game? I remember one of the sideline reports. I think Todd McShay was on a game, and he's talking about how by far he's the best athlete on the field jumping off at the page. But to me, I saw too many times this year where he was a little undisciplined coming off the edge. You talked about him playing out of position a little bit. That could get fixed this year. He did improve as the season went along, but especially early on, he was coming upfield a lot. I would see him coming upfield a lot. I'd like to see him play a little more. I think it's good. You'd rather I think I heard Gus Bradley when he was coaching the Jaguars back in the day say you'd rather tell a horse whoa than giddy up, so the guy's out there trying to make some plays. Can't fault him for that, but I do like his energy, the fact that he's getting out there. He's in the mix a lot of times. You see him around the ball a lot too. I do like that about him. I think he can clean it up a little bit and be more effective on the field. The other thing too, you talked about the attitude, the defensive attitude. Man, if you guys haven't looked up with Shelton from Penn State, Taylor Shelton, just go on YouTube, check it out. He's got a clip on there where he's got the whole team circled up around him. He's the guy charging them up before the game, yelling at them and everything. And I think that type of leadership, he just strikes me as a guy that's not going to come in and be quiet on day one. He strikes me as a guy that's going to step in there and have a presence in that locker room from day one. So even, again, we talked about not necessarily showing up on the stat sheet, could be a good boost for the guys around him.
Yeah, I really do like the makeup of this defensive front. The defensive tackles were a necessity. I mean, you didn't want to have to rely on Gervon Dexter and those unproven defensive tackles that you had, you didn't get to see a lot of last year. That was not going to cut it for Florida after the issues that we saw from this defense last year. So I think, the front 6, 7, however they want to break it up there for the Gators and formation wise. I do wonder, do we see anything different? Is this, from this defensive front, that's Todd Grantham's baby, not the secondary. You can kind of go to the linebackers a bit too, but the outside linebackers, the defensive line, that's Todd Grantham's baby. And at points last year, it was not there. You didn't get the pressure with any kind of consistency. You were always able kind of to rely on Florida being able to a good run defense. And even in the bigger games last year, especially the Texas A&M game, that was a good running team. Don't get me wrong, but that was a team that just kind of torched Florida there at the beginning of the year. And then of course Alabama did what they did versus everybody. That's probably the two performances there. If you want to look at a lackluster rush defense there for the Gators, but combining defensive tackle, defensive end, what we just discussed, I like it as a starting point, but of course, I think we just kind of have to see the culture change for me is going to have to come there, starting up front. We saw even with you had C.J. Henderson back there in years previous for Todd Grantham defense, and the defensive. I still think the defensive front helped that secondary a bit more when they weren't getting the pressure. You saw the safety play and how bad it could get. You saw the corners not being able to cover and the communication between the corners and the safeties. I think the defensive front being able to get to the quarterback masked a lot of those issues in 2018, 2019. You didn't get that last year. So I do think, it's pretty big. If we're a Todd Grantham defense, I've said this before, it probably relies too much on the defensive front.
Yeah, I mean, I think – it does, but that's his calling card, right? I mean, that's what he relies on. He's going to blitz. He's going to leave his guys out on islands. And we have seen that sometimes on third downs, it's a problem when we haven't been able to get to the quarterback. Anytime that we played Jake Fromm or when we played Joe Burrow a couple years ago, couldn't get to him. And then at that point, there wasn't anything you could do when you couldn't get to the quarterback because the defensive backfield couldn't hold up. I think it's interesting. I mentioned double teams. So if you go back and you look at 2018, Ja'Kai Polite leads the team with 11 sacks. And then you had Zuniga with 6.5 on the outside. Voshan Joseph had 4. And then pretty much nobody had more than 2 or 3 sacks the whole way through that team. You go to last year or 2019, and you've got Jonathan Gennard has 10 sacks, then Zach Carter with 4.5, and then a whole bunch of people who are sort of at the 2 or 3 sack mark. Diabate had 4 back in 2019, and then you go to 2020, and there just isn't that guy who has 10. Right, you've got Carter who's got 5, you've got Cox with 3.5, Ventrell Miller with 3.5, Chris Bogle with 3.5, and then you got the sort of smorgasbord of people at 3 and 2. Florida still had a lot of sacks last year, but it was much more spread out amongst the various defensive linemen, which to me says, one, that they weren't winning one. There wasn't one guy who was winning one-on-one battles consistently. And then the other thing that it says is that they were probably generating those sacks by bringing extra pressure, right? That sometimes the blitzer gets the sack, sometimes the defensive lineman gets the sack, or the defensive end gets the sack, sometimes the defensive tackle gets the sack based on where the breakdown is, as opposed to just a guy winning the battle one-on-one. And so that's what they need this year. They need a defensive lineman who can put up 10, 11, 12 sacks, who can win the one-on-one battles, who can command double teams and free up the rest of the defensive linemen, regardless of whether they're bringing a blitz or not. And then you can drop into coverage while still getting to the quarterback. And, if you think back to 2018 when the defense was really good, particularly the game against LSU with the pick 6 against Burrow, they just absolutely tormented Burrow. And it was mostly with the front 4. Every once in a while, Voshan Joseph came on a blitz, but for the most part, it was the front 4. It was Polite, and it was Zuniga just driving him crazy. And they got that fumble. LSU drove right down the field, scored a touchdown the first drive. We're driving down again. Polite hits Burrow from the backside, and the game was completely different from then on. And that's what was missing this year, right? There weren't a whole lot of turnovers. There weren't ducks that came flying out from the quarterback where the defensive backs had easy picks. There weren't strip sacks for fumbles. There wasn't any of that stuff. It was, they still got a lot of sacks, but it always came from Grantham having to try to generate it. So that's what I'm looking for this year is they need one guy or maybe 2 guys to show that they can win one-on-one battles individually. Some of that comes from Savage. Some of that comes from next year of experience. And some of that comes from the discipline to hold each other accountable and really have an off season where you get to a point where you're operating as a unit.
Yeah, Nick, that's probably the biggest thing Will just brought up. The havoc that was not there that did not end up creating turnovers. And that, there were 2 things. You had your DBs playing 10 yards off when they didn't need to. And then with that, with the pressure not being there, that's what you were getting. You had quarterbacks just being able to pick apart a defense because there was no havoc, no pressure, and hopefully, all these pieces on the front now that kind of fixes that. That's when we're talking about up front, that's the first issue that needs to be fixed. There needs to be that havoc that we were used to seeing in the first couple of years.
And we could have maybe clued into this at the end of 2019 too, because game 1 against Miami, right? 10 sacks. John Grenard, absolute beast, right? And then once that LSU game hit and we're missing Zuniga and Grenard, what happened to the pressure after that? It wasn't coming from like we didn't have that next guy step in. You hope Cox. We talked about Cox already. You hope he'd develop into that this year. Didn't quite happen, but it's like Will said. I think this was a defense this year that just wasn't entirely complete across the board, and I think the playing out of positions thing was a big deal. I think it was a big deal, and we don't know how many injuries these guys are dealing with too. I definitely think that some of that had an effect on the season. So I think that we've seen it before. That's the thing I was almost defensive of the defense through like the early points of the middle point of the season, because I figure it was a rough start. They're coming out of training camp. I saw them kind of getting it together in that middle stretch. I know that middle stretch is hard to remember. That Missouri, Georgia, like that stuff's kind of hard to remember with the way we finished the season. But there was some decent play in the middle there, but the consistency throughout the year, it just wasn't there overall. And that's what you like to see that come together. And I'm with you guys. When the defense has worked with Grantham in the past, it started up front.
All right, we'll get into the linebackers in the secondary and all the changes going on there. But before we get there, Tampa Bay versus Kansas City. A champion is going to be crowned. It's time for the Super Bowl, and it's time to win big. You've heard the name just about everywhere. MyBookie. They're the industry's leading online sportsbook and casino, and it's not hard to understand why, with thousands of lines to bet on all your favorite sports. NFL, NBA, college ball, MMA, soccer, they got it all. The latest odds, period. Take advantage of MyBookie's prop builder and live in-game betting, where every single run, throw, and touchdown is another chance for you to put cash in your pocket. Visit MyBookie's mobile-friendly website today and get your deposit matched halfway up to $1,000. Just use promo code Gators when you make your first deposit. The best part is they make it simple with a variety of ways to deposit instantly, including credit card, bank transfer, Bitcoin, and more. Whether you're at home or on the go, or on your laptop or on your phone, it's not too late to make your New Year's resolution a resolution to get paid. Bet, win, and get paid at MyBookie using promo code Gators. All right, let's move to the second level of the defense and linebacker. And this was this position here, it was weird starting 2020 season. Ventrell Miller, James Houston were the two names you were really kind of counting on there. But it ended up being Ventrell Miller there in the middle. And then Amari Burney, Mahmoud Diabate as the season went on. Amari Burney started the season. You saw the troubles that were there. Diabate started getting more playing time. And I thought, toward the end of the season, kind of solidified himself in that, second linebacker role there beside Ventrell Miller. Miller will be back for 2021. I still think you'll see a lot of Mahmoud Diabate there, but I know we want to see more Tyron Hopper and Derek Wingo. Those are the two names there. If you're looking at the future of the linebacker position, along with Diabate, it's those two names. We'll kind of have to see, where just kind of how you split up the time between those. You really hope Hopper or Wingo are guys that are forcing their way in to get more playing time. And to me, also, kind of lets you share Diabate and some the other positions. I think he's we mentioned the edge rushers just a bit ago. I still think Diabate has a role there as well, dating back to his freshman year a couple years ago. But, one name I really think we have to watch out for, and another name just because, I know because they were recruited, you kind of maybe see those guys in the secondary a bit too. But watch out for him to play a little bit of linebacker, especially in kind of speed packages there. DeJuan Black, Donovan McMillan, they're especially Black, and then we've kind of just been waiting on his time to show up as a Gator. He should be enrolling in May, be on campus in May there. I think he's a guy out there and watch out for, just the freak athleticism that you can put on the field of one-to-one Black. I'm not sure how much we'd see him at linebacker. I think he had the chance to crack the rotation there. But for the guys we know that will be there, Miller, Diabate, Hopper, Wingo, that there's four guys there that need to be on the field. If you look, I think in Florida's best position, the more Wingo and Hopper are out there, probably the better looking this defense will look on that second level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting. I know everybody wanted to see Hopper and wanted to see Wingo last year. I'm not sure that they would have been able to hold up with the defensive line, allowing the linebackers getting to get mauled by the offensive linemen. And I think that was a big concern for Grantham, is putting out guys who are, they might shoot gaps, but when they shoot a gap, if there's a pulling guard sitting right there, they're not big enough to be able to take him on and actually make the play. Now, discipline in the gaps, I'm sure, was also an issue. And then knowing what to do in pass coverage, we saw that was really, I think, where the linebackers, particularly Diabate and Bernie, struggled, especially early on in the year. But even in the SEC championship game, Najee Harris is a really good player. And so I don't want to take a whole lot away from him. At the same time, if you're going to cover the running back with a linebacker, the linebacker has to be able to run with him. And Diabate and Miller really couldn't do that. The defense really missed David Reese. I mean, and it seems simplistic to say that, but it turns out that a middle linebacker who puts up 100 tackles every year and is the quarterback of your defense for 4 straight years is a really big loss. And we sort of overlooked it, I think, coming into the year, because he is not the most physically gifted player, right? I think he may have gotten on an NFL practice squad, but then didn't actually make a team. And, he was not a guy who just popped off the page in terms of his athletic ability. But 4 years, the leadership that he showed, especially with the whole, death threat McElwain stuff going on in 2017, the fact that his teammates loved him, and he was productive, right? I mean, there were times where he got taken advantage of with, running backs in coverage, but there were also times where he was always in the right spot and could really help in the running game. And taking him out of there, I don't think it's a coincidence that the running game went from a top 15 running game to something that was, in the 80s or 90s in terms of yards per play.
Yeah, and before you go on, maybe the Kentucky game in 2018 was something we should have went and looked back at to kind of maybe forecast what top of season 2020 was going to bring without David Reese there. I mean, I hate to play revisionist history that way and say, oh yeah, that would have been easy to go back and look at, but man, a lot of what we saw in that game was what we saw game after game in 2020.
Well, I say a lot of stupid stuff, so I don't want people going back and listening too much to the podcast. But I do remember you and I talking about that and saying, that's our concern, is that losing a guy like Reese is, we saw what happened. He made a bunch of big 4th down stops in that Kentucky game, and that allowed Kyle Trask to make that comeback. And, the reality.
In the year before, he didn't play in the Kentucky game, and Florida's defense was lost without him.
Yeah, and, that's to be expected, right? When you lose a middle linebacker who's been out there for so long. But that's also a black mark on the coaching staff, because you have to have guys who are ready to jump in. And it felt like Miller took maybe half the year to sort of get his sea legs as a middle linebacker. I do think he played a lot better as the season went on. The problem is still, again, when the offensive guard is mauling you in the running game, there's nothing you can do as a linebacker. Like the job of the defensive front is to keep the offensive line off of you, especially in a 3-4 defense. I realize Grantham runs a 1 gap that's really kind of more like a 4-3, or it's more of a hybrid than it is a true 3-4, where it's like a 2 gap with the defensive tackle. But still, the defensive tackles have to occupy the offensive line to allow the linebackers to make plays. When the defensive line was able to do that, I think Ventrell Miller was able to make plays, at least inside the box. The thing that's exciting about Diabate is that when the ball got either thrown or run to the edge, he was the guy who was able to get out there and make the play. Granted, he's playing outside linebacker, but still, to be able to go side to side is something we haven't seen at Florida in a while. That's where I think Wingo and Hopper really bring value, is they are guys who have the speed to be able to get to the outside, stop guys from getting the corner, all the little throws to the running back that have just tormented Florida now for like a decade. I mean, the game against Tennessee this year, the little swing passes that Bailey was hitting to his running back were really the only kind of offense that the Vols had, but there were multiple times where it was either a blown coverage or the linebacker just couldn't get out there in time. And so hopefully those things start to go away as we get more gifted guys in there. But it still comes – I mean, it's funny. We can talk about the linebackers all we want, but part of the problem is that the linebackers are still going to be a relatively small group. I don't think that Wingo and Hopper and DeJuan Black are all going to be these giant linebackers. They're going to be relying on speed. And so if you're going to have guys out there who are relying on speed, you have to keep the offensive linemen off of them. You can't let them get to the second level. And then you want to let them roam free. So it's a symbiotic thing, right? I mean, you have to have the defensive tackles to do that. I think some of these transfers they brought in give them that opportunity. And so I'm excited to see, again, another year in Savage's strength program, but I'm excited to see what these guys can do with their speed when they're not getting occupied by offensive linemen.
Well, that goes back to a couple of weeks ago. Nick, you can chime in here with this. When we were going back and looking at our over-unders that we so badly missed on the defensive side this past year, it was I pointed to the defense saying, look, I like the makeup of this defense going into 2020 because of how fast they would be and the speed that they recruited at, especially the linebacker position. But that turned out to be a deterrent for this defense because they didn't get the normal offseason strength training. And I really think, going to Will's point, the defensive tackles just get mauled over and over again. Yeah, Nick, maybe maybe I put too much on the speed going into 2020, but maybe it can be somewhat of a strength if these guys come around to fix the physicality part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, if up front gets fixed, the linebackers are going to have a much easier time too. It's that simple. I hate to sound really simple about that too, but Wingo is a guy that you just want to see really develop. And the common theme we're seeing I think we're going to see at each level of the defense is really there's going to be a strong reliance on the youth movement this year. And I'm talking freshman, sophomore, redshirt, freshman. You're going to see a lot of hope in Gator Nation for these guys to really step in and become the type of players like a Kyrie Elam, where he's a steady guy week in and week out that you can count on. So I think Hopper, from the tape, you go back, you watch a lot of the high school tape, Hopper, super explosive athlete. I mean, you can't get much better than that at the linebacker position. Wingo seems like he's going to bring an element of physicality to the linebacker spot. I love the tape on Jeremiah Williams, too, out of Birmingham, Alabama. I know Auburn was after him for a while. He's coming in this year. He looks like he could be a guy. Maybe he's not going to contribute right away, but the next few years, the future's bright at all these spots. So whether or not we totally work out the situation in 2021, I think the future's bright with some of these guys they're bringing in. And then I call him a three-star player with a 5-star name, Chief Borders. That guy can hit.
Yeah.
I watch, he can hit.
He was a tackling machine this year in his senior year. But yeah, you're right. And he's kind of a guy. He's kind of a David Reese guy to me. I don't know how he would be in coverage and covering running backside the backfield. But as far as a guy that's going to stick his head in there and get in there with an opposing run game, you mentioned the 5-star name Chief Borders. It fits a tough linebacker name.
Yeah, 6'4", 230 coming in too. I know Will talked about some of the size. I mean, that's as a freshman coming in out of high school, 6'4", 240. Jeremiah Williams, 6'4", 225. So hopefully they see maybe they're recruiting these bigger guys too because they see that maybe we went a little too small in some of these guys, and maybe they're correcting that too. There might be some course correction on that, but I'm with you. If you can't play up front, the speed doesn't matter that much. It's gonna get nullified a little bit.
Yep. That was something I did not see in 2020. Hopefully we don't see again in 2021. Here we go. Now on to the secondary and all the change that's going on there. First the new coaches. I think we'll start there first. Out are Torian Gray and Ron English. In come Wesley McGriff from Auburn and Jules Montanar from USF. It was announced today that Montanar will be the cornerback coach and recruiting coordinator, while McGriff will coach the safeties there. So had an entire show of McGriff that you guys can go back and listen to from a couple weeks ago that'll give you all you need to know there. But I'm not going to lie, guys. I don't know a whole lot about Jules Montanar until his name come up late last week. I do know Mullen wanted a young, energetic hire here, not a rehired, retread guy out there. I doubt Montanaro was a top choice, but I don't know enough to say good or bad here. Of course, a bigger name would have been nice. I do like the short history that he brings to the table. He's been around some recruiting behemoths. Was a grad assistant at Alabama and Georgia, so the connection to Saban and Kirby Smart. And then was hired by Jeff Scott at USF. Scott was assembling his first staff at USF last year after he left Clemson to become the head coach at South Florida. He hired Montanar away from Georgia, and Montanar was made the cornerback coach and recruiting coordinator for the Bulls last year. So, there's some things to like there. McGriff, much like most of Mullen's staffs, known more as a coach and a developer more so than a recruiter. So hopefully, Montanar can be a great recruiter in the secondary. Guys, we'll get to players in just a second. I think we all thought Florida needed a change at defensive coordinator, but that wasn't the move Dan Mullen made here. Instead, moves were made in the secondary with McGriff and Montanar.
Yeah, well, this is going to be where he makes or breaks his time here at Florida. I think everybody's pretty confident that Mullen's going to be able to get the most out of his offense. The question is going to be what happens on the defensive side of the ball. I don't think a lot of us are real confident in Grantham's ability. I think we're all I think we're all pretty confident that it's going to be better than last year. The question is it going to be good enough for Florida to compete for championships? And I think we've got some doubts there. But at the same time, I think you support your team and you support your defensive coordinator, you support your coach and say, okay, well, let's see what happens with these guys that they've made the changes to. Obviously, Montanar, is coming from USF, somebody who's dealt with recruiting in Florida and Georgia at a lower level, obviously. So you're not expecting him to have some sort of resume that's got 5 stars all over it. At the same time, the question that you need to ask, and I really haven't had a chance to go back and look at it that extensively, but the question you want to ask is he bringing in better recruits than the guy before him? Right. So did USF's recruiting pick up when they brought him in as a recruiting coordinator? That's the thing to look at, I think, when we go back and look at him. And then McGriff, you mentioned more of an on-field guy, except for when you start looking back in his history, Robert Kimdiche at Ole Miss, he was the primary recruiter for him, the number 1 overall recruit for Ole Miss. Tony Connor, another 5-star at Ole Miss in 2013, the number 33 overall recruit. Brandon Harris, number 25 overall recruit from Miami in 2008. And then he did bring in Evan Ingram. So he was the 920th overall recruit for Ole Miss. But guy turns out to be an outstanding tight end, goes to the NFL, and now he's on everybody's fantasy team because he's a really, really good player. So it is interesting. One thing that's really interesting is when you look through his recruiting profile, the 5-star guys and really even the high 4-star guys didn't really amount to much in terms of either college production or making it to the pros. But he's got some sort of jewels in the rough down there in the low 3-star range who do seem to have been converted. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think, Mullen had the unfortunate timing of needing to find secondary coaches at the exact same time that Urban Meyer did as well. And unfortunately, they all have the same connections, right? So we all know these aren't the top 2 selections because the top 2 selections are in Jacksonville coaching for the Jaguars because of all, and I don't think anybody's going to admit that, but I think that's pretty much what most people suspect is that, guys like Chris Ash and Charlie Strong and stuff like that are people they probably would have looked at first, but Urban Meyer wanted them. It was an NFL opportunity. They decided to go there. I think these guys are going to do an okay job, but I don't think they're the first choice. And I mean, I think they are good coaches. I think time will tell whether they're really difference makers. I don't know that there's a whole lot in their background that suggests they're going to be huge difference makers. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be, can you get guys stronger? And are the guys that Florida's recruited going to be able to step in and play at a much higher level than they did last year?
Will, or Nick, to build off Will's point there, are they better than Torian Gray and Ron English? I mean, that's really the point here right now at this point.
Problem solved, guys. Ron English. I know everybody was screaming at Ron English when coverages were blown last year. I'm sure everyone was screaming Torian Gray's name when coverages were blown last year. This just seems like
after they screamed Todd Grantham's name.
Yeah, no, that's my point. Nobody's yelling. These guys were absolutely like the absolute minimal changes you could have made this year. Like after the way it was on defense, and I had a whole thing right out here about like. Basically, Nick Saban admitted this year finally, which, I mean, he's admitted by changing his style on the field, but Nick Saban's out there this year saying good offense beats good defense. And that's just the style of football these days. So I know like we're a school that we want to win every game 50-0. And if it's not, we're going to dissect it and let's have a big talk about it. And that's what's great about Florida too, by the way. But college football these days, if you're keeping teams in the low to mid 20s, you just have to be good. You don't even have to be. We're not looking for the 85 Bears anymore. So everyone's playing. A lot of these schools are playing these up tempo offenses. It's tough to hold them down for an entire game. I mean, you even look at a school like Ole Miss. How good were they on the offensive side of the ball this year? When are we used to seeing Ole Miss dominate at anything pretty much over the course of the last 25 years? So they had a couple-year run, but it's all about the offense now. So when you look at it. The game is different. You're never going to have that great killer defense, 9-6 Alabama, LSU. Those days are done. But the thing about you got to look at this year is we had a national championship level offense, and this defense just had to be like just fairly okay, just good. It didn't have to be excellent. It just had to be good to give this team a shot, and it couldn't even live up to that. And that's
2018, 2019 defense, it would have been good enough.
Yeah, and that's where, I mean, you look at the A&M game, you look at the LSU game, or the two games, I really think a lot of the fan base, I don't think we're mentally over the LSU loss. And especially defensively, I watched Johnson play against Texas A&M at quarterback for LSU a few weeks earlier, and they couldn't do anything on offense. So the fact they came into the swamp and did that, I mean, you could talk about 100 different things, unfocused, poor effort here or there. Like, you talk about a bunch of different things. I think that game alone should signify that a change needed to be made overall. And maybe that could have been the approach from the top, but I don't really care. Dan Mullen doesn't count the cotton bowl, so I won't either. But the defense really cost this team a national title this year, or really a serious shot at one, because the offense went toe to toe. Was Kyle Trask scared of those helmets against Alabama? No, they were scoring points. They put up 46. He wasn't afraid to put it in the end zone. And so I really look at it, and you got to, if you're honest with yourself, you're Dan Mullen, the defense cost you. So you need to make a change there. And Will has written a lot of great pieces. Will's piece on Grantham on Read Your Reaction, if you haven't read it, make sure you check that out. But on why they should let go of Grantham is perfect. I mean, it really, he talks about, he's not the difference maker in terms of recruiting. He's marginal in a lot of areas, and I think we could do better as a program. And the offensive side of the ball is at that level. The defense is not. And I know it's a lot of young players, and maybe Grantham got a bad hand because we saw him get 10 sacks against Miami, right? We know the guy can coach. I'm not saying he's a terrible coach, but it cost the team a national title this year. And I think that it doesn't seem like a serious approach if you're just replacing two assistants where 95% of the fan base might not have known Ron English's name until he was fired.
So yeah, here we go. Well, those are the two new hires, and the guys they'll be coaching back here on the secondary. Look, we'll start at cornerback. Of course, Elam locks down one side, no question there. But I'm really interested in seeing how quickly top-rated recruit Jason Marshall throws his name into the mix at the other cornerback spot. Jadon Hill gets first chance there, I think, but Marshall comes in as this heralded recruit, and then there's a chance he adds to the long line of freshmen that have just come in and made a name for themselves at the cornerback position. Let's not forget Kamar Wilcoxon as well. He's new to the watch here, I think, just as another highly rated recruit. This was supposed to be his first season, but he come in last year early. So his experience, I think, that he garnered last year will be key here. You have names like Jahiri Rogers, Avery Helm, Ethan Pouncey, Jordan Young as well. So much youth there behind, along, as you kind of pointed to, Nick, along this whole defense, but a lot of youth here in the secondary as well. Elam is the only veteran of the group. So you're trying to figure out ways to improve on defense, and especially on the back end. It'll be starting with some young quarterbacks besides the Elam. So these new coaches have their work cut out for them. Well, young guys, but also you've got to fix the tackling issues, the communication issues, getting lined up and knowing where you're supposed to be before the snap and after the snap, communication before the snap and after the snap. I mean, it's not just throwing guys out there and just be better players. There's a lot of internal, a lot of mental things to fix with this defense as well. So, these new coaches got their work cut out for them.
I was going to say, it's a good thing we got new defensive back coaches to teach them all that stuff. So Florida took a calculated risk this year, and the risk that they took was that they were going to be able to get enough decent play out of the guys that they threw out there who were experienced, that they were going to be able to compete with the Alabamas and the A&Ms and unfortunately the LSUs of the world. And it turned out they weren't good enough to make that happen, right? And that's what everybody knows about the 2020 season, is that Florida had a national championship offense and didn't have a defense that could step up the same way. The problem is when you go back and so all those guys come from the 2017 recruiting class. The problem is when you then look at the 2018 recruiting class, there aren't any corners there. There's Bernie, who got moved to linebacker, and there's Dean, who's a safety and moved back to safety and likely is going to play quite a bit at safety. I think probably this year, he announced he's coming back. So the fact that they've got a guy back there who has some experience and really did seem to improve towards the end of the year, I think is a benefit, but I'm still not ready to hang my hat on Trey Dean as a lockdown safety. He just hasn't shown it yet. Elam obviously steps in 2019. You got Chester Kembra who leaves, and so Jadon Hill's the only other defensive back from that class that we really might expect something from this year, which means Florida's really relying on young guys, right? Jahari Rogers, Ethan Pouncey, Kamar Wilcoxon, Rashad Torrance, Avery Helm, Mordecai McDaniel, Finley Graham. those are guys that they signed in 2020. It's great that they signed all those defensive backs, but we saw what happened when a lot of those guys played against Oklahoma. And granted, the motivation wasn't necessarily where it needed to be for that Oklahoma game, but still, you'd figure that pride would have you out there playing hard. And the reality is that I didn't see anything. There was nobody who flashed at me at the cornerback spot there. So yeah, I think one thing about Grantham and one thing about Mullen is that they have not often drawn on their recruiting class of that current year to perform early. And so
we've known this staff to be known for more their development over time than throwing freshmen out there.
Yeah. So you're looking at one, maybe two guys from the 2021 class who are going to contribute. And this is actually where I think who they signed, not necessarily the stars matter. Now, it matters that these guys are high-level guys, but Jason Marshall is a five-star cornerback. Corey Collier is almost a five-star safety, and then Donovan McMillan is a top 100 safety. And you start factoring those guys in. If they get two or three of those guys who can step up in the defensive backfield, then this defense has a shot to really take a step forward. If instead they're relying on the guys from 2020, I think they'll be okay. I don't think they can get much worse. But I think they'll be okay. I just don't necessarily, again, limited time. We haven't seen all these guys, but you would figure that if one of them was really flashing at all in practice, that they would have gotten an opportunity. And the only guys we really saw Rashard Torrance play significant, and we saw Trevez Johnson play significant playing time. Neither one of them really starting, but those guys did play significant snaps. So I think with Dean and Torrance and Johnson, probably be okay at safety, but Marshall needs to step in and be a starting quarterback day one if this defense is going to be what we hope it can be. But again, I think 2021 is kind of a transition year with Emory Jones taking over at quarterback. You're probably not going to have a national championship level offense. And so this probably is a year where you can experience some growing pains there on the back end, making sure that everybody gets playing time so you know what you have, so that in 2022, when Jones is back and the offense is really starting to hum, you've got a defense that can step up. Because really, Bill Sykes wrote something a couple of weeks ago for my site that looked at sort of the idea of clustering and having recruiting classes that all sort of mature at the same time. And that's what's necessary for SEC championships when you're not Alabama. And what we saw last year is a perfect example of that, is that Florida had a sort of a confluence of clustering that occurred on the offensive side of the ball, where you've got Kyle Pitts and Kadarius Toney and Kyle Trask and all of those guys who sort of all came together to form that kind of offense. And the defense just didn't have that same phenomenon. And so what you don't want is you don't want the defense to peak next year if you don't think the offense is going to be as good. What you kind of want to do is make sure you know who you've got so that 2 years from now you can have sort of those clusters hit at the same time.
Nick will move the safety a bit too, but would it be a good sign to you if Marshall comes in early and is the starting cornerback opposite of Elam, or would you expect somebody like Hill to kind of still be out there and Marshall having to work his way in throughout the entire season instead of maybe just starting the season there?
I mean, ideally, you'd like to see both, right? You don't want it to be that Hill is so bad that Marshall has to step in.
Yeah.
So you'd like to see Hill develop, but quarterback might be the one position on the defensive side where, hey, if we have to throw a freshman out there, I feel okay about that one if he's got the talent. We didn't get great cornerback play from I'm not going to beat the guy up. He's been beat up enough that we didn't get great quarterback play opposite of Elam last year. And I'd like to see. I think we can improve upon that. But Hill certainly can take a step forward. But I think by the end of the season, Marshall's going to be that guy. I mean, he's just very good coming out of Palmetto there. But the other guy too. I know you don't want to jump to the safety maybe just yet, but Collier too looks very, very intriguing coming into the secondary. And I think it was an issue. There was a lot of communication across both points of the secondary last year. And I don't know if the coverages are too complicated or what was going on. But the one thing you really need to see is that quarterback of the secondary step up next year. Really, let's hope we're making calls and lining up on time and everything next year. That's the big improvement I want to see in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, the communication thing, I just don't get it because we didn't see it in 2018 and 2019. So why did it all of a sudden manifest in 2020 when a lot of it was the same guys back there? I think that's a mystery. I just don't know because we can sit here and say that the defense is complicated, but those are guys that had been in the defense.
Right.
So if it was going to be complicated, you may see it this year with Trey Dean not getting a whole lot of time at safety, Rashad Torrance, not playing a whole lot, and then throw in somebody like a Jason Marshall, Corey Carter. I would expect the communication issues to be more of an issue this year with all the new faces, more so than last year with Steiner and Stewart and Davis all back there with Elam and Marco, guys who know or should know the defense, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, can't communicate and know their assignment. So, I do think the defense is complicated, but it shouldn't have been complicated for the guys that were out there.
And that's the issue with Grantham, right? That's why everybody is worried about Grantham coming back, is that the communication issues and the disciplinary issues that cropped up. So Nick, you mentioned earlier that nobody's over the LSU game. It's because I've never seen someone lose a game chucking a shoe. But chucking the shoe is indicative of a lack of discipline that the defense showed all year long. And you're sitting there staring at juniors and seniors going, why are we having so much trouble lining up? Why are we lining up 10 yards off the line of scrimmage? Why are we throwing shoes? And, the shoes are ridiculous, but they're indicative of the overall problem that people can see with the defense, which is you're not getting physically beat, you're getting mentally beat. And getting mentally beat really at this level is unacceptable 9, 10, 11 games into the year. Throw a true freshman in there who's really gifted and going to get mentally beat too. What's the difference? I know somebody after the A&M game, I think they either texted us or tweeted at us, Dave, about out of the total possible yards A&M could have gotten in that game, I think they wound up with 6 less yards than they could have gotten. So every time they got the ball, or no, it was like 60, but one of them was on the fumble. That Stewart knocked the ball out on the fumble. Other than that, they always drove down the field every time they got the ball. So if they're going to do that anyway, what's the harm in putting a freshman out there who's going to blow a coverage, right? And I get that logic, especially now that you know how 2020 ended, to say, wow, it would have been really nice if we knew what we had with some of these young guys and we'd actually played them. I get that in the heat of it, you're sitting there saying, hey, we're 7-1, 8-1. Right before that LSU game, you're saying we still got a shot to win the title. We got to fix some stuff with the guys we've got out there. So I get why they did it, but the fact that they did it means there's going to be some growing pains in 2021. And you just hope that perhaps the new guys that they're bringing in can help instill a discipline that just wasn't there in 2020, because I can't go through another fog bowl where we lose on something ridiculous, disciplinary related. I might go crazy.
Let's start blaming Evan McPherson for that loss. How about that? That's another shoe we could blame it on. But no, I mean, the thing is, think about the defense from game one to the final outing of the season. What difference did you see? What adjustments did we see made? And I know I'm not saying anything new, but the lack of adjustments was just infuriating to watch. And I mean, even though we all walked away from that Alabama game going, "Hey, great effort, guys!" I was proud of my school watching them play against Alabama. But did you just feel incredibly helpless in the first half watching that defense just get shredded? I mean, it's something where you look at it and you go, "What if this is going to happen? Invest in the youth." And I think that's the message that you have to learn going into this year. Because man, some of these young guys, they look super talented coming in, and that's not a knock on the guys who are there. They're plenty talented too. But if we're gonna struggle with simple things, freshmen are supposed to struggle with communications. That's why you play your seniors, right? If we're gonna do that anyway, give the young guys talent that the time that they can develop that, and then, like Will said, we're peaking at the right time, 22, 23.
Yeah, at safety, I'm excited for Corey Collier to come in, but with Dean and Torrance there, I mean, I think that trio there should be good enough. I think we'll have to, certainly everything here is just we have to see because of just how bad 2020 was. It's hard to pinpoint. Hey, this was something we're excited to see, but Trey Dean, for all the hassle he went through in 2018 and 2019, I think to finally show some sort of consistency at safety when he was out there. I know he battled some injuries throughout the year as well. He had the big play versus Alabama, of course, before he blindsided there and fumbles the ball. But probably the biggest play for the defense in that game, if it would have held up, coming from Trey Dean there, and who knows how the game would have turned out if it just would have been a normal tackle and Florida has the ball there. So you had a knack for making plays in the big game there from Trey Dean. Look, but switch to nickel as well. I think Will brought up Tre'Vez Johnson's name there. I think we'll probably see him get first crack at the nickel star position. So some ability, especially in the red zone earlier in the 2020 season, and wasn't much of a factor as the season progressed. But I think they liked him in that red zone role. Dakota Mitchell's a signee to watch there as well, but. Once again, we said it. It doesn't matter who's back there. If communication pre-snap, post-snap isn't there, hopefully a more physical camp gets these guys ready to tackle, something that plagued them all season as well. In the secondary is arm tackle after arm tackle or just trying to go up and pop somebody without wrapping up. We saw it all season long. It's just, one more example of the lack of physicality and strength and conditioning that hurt the Gators last year. Far from DBU for the Gators and a ton of questions on the back end. But, go back to last season, and it's not like all the experience was returning, as you guys said. It wasn't like all that experience that was returning paid off. So hopefully new coaches, new voices, new faces back there in the secondary speaks to some kind of improvement back there.
I mean, I think we certainly hope so. The problem is that when you look back at the stats, right? So
you worked for Arkansas a bit last year, so come on.
So Florida hasn't been good against the pass in any of Grantham's 3 years. So they ranked 40th in yards per pass allowed in 2018, and that was with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and C.J. Henderson, two guys who are high-level NFL players in the backfield. In 2019, they ranked 35th, so a little bit better with C.J. Henderson and then Kyrie Elam on the other side. So really, two corners who are going to play in the league.
And you actually had a good Marco in the star in 2019. He didn't play the star position bad in 2019.
Yeah, well, and this year, you look at Elam, is really the only guy in the secondary who was decent, and they dropped down to 88th. So if Marshall comes in and plays really, really well on the outside along with Elam, you're looking at a defense that's probably somewhere 40th to 45th overall in yards per pass, which means they're going to have to improve considerably against yards per rush to get off the field. Now, they're going to get off the field more than they did last year. The defense is going to improve compared to what it did last year. And I hope what people don't do is that they don't look at it and go, oh, well, it's better than last year, so Grantham's showing progress. That's not what I think progress is. I think progress is a defense that makes advances beyond where he has been. So really, if you think about yards per pass allowed, they need to be better than 40th. If you think about yards per rush, they probably need to be top 20. And that's going to create a defense that's like maybe 20th or 30th in points per game allowed, which is a significant improvement over the defense that they had last year. The problem is that after this year, Kyrie Elam's going to be gone. So then you're going to have to replace that corner again. So it goes back to, in my mind, 2021 is a year where Grantham has to get a lot of guys out there, understand what he has, and get a lot of experience, even if it means they sacrifice a game or two. Because at the end of the day, when Elam goes pro, you're going to need somebody to replace him, and you can't be sitting there going, well, can we replace him with this guy? The reality is that you're just not going to be able to do that. And we saw that this year, right? Is that Henderson leaves. They thought Marco Wilson was going to be able to step into that role. He couldn't. And then the defense just really, really struggled. And it's not all Marco's fault. I mean, obviously there were holes in other places too. But I mean, if you think about the guys playing so far off the line of scrimmage, the reason they were playing that far off is that when they manned up and went up close, they got beat. Mm-hmm. And so, I just sort of look at it and say progress needs to be measured more in just, we're better than 2020. Progress really needs to be, are we as good as 2019? And if you can't get back to that level with your own recruits, then the fan base isn't going to be happy with anything less than that.
Nick, last thought here. I've said the only way they could justify, and this is behind the scenes, I have no idea. The only way the justification of keeping Todd Grantham is something has to change. There has to be a heart-to-heart. There has to be a heart-to-heart between Dan Mullen and Todd Grantham that, hey, 2020 was unacceptable. You still have a job here. Something has to change. And we're not going to know how that conversation went, if that conversation even happened. We won't even know. Todd Grantham cannot trot out there and put the same defense, the same style of defense, the same style of calls. That can't happen again in 2020 or 2021. Something has to change. We don't know what that change is going to be. But somewhere along the way, the only justification of keeping your job is you have to change.
I'm willing to consider that on a super optimistic level. But I think Todd Grantham is who Todd Grantham is. And
I do too. That's the scary part.
I think we've seen it at this point. I mean, even when he was hired, what was the general feeling when he was hired? What did people talk about? His time at Georgia, right? Are we kind of seeing some similarities on some level there with the blitz? The blitzing's a little out of control at times. It's not always when it works. The thing with Grantham, though, that's kind of interesting is when it works, it seems to work really well. 10 sacks against Miami. I brought that game up. But when it doesn't, it really doesn't. And does it work in big moments? I mean, we saw the 2019 Georgia loss, right? We blew the total blown coverage on Cager. We were in that game. Total blown coverage. We saw blown coverages kill us last year. The one thing we might be underestimating about maybe some of the lack of adjustments or lack of youth we saw last year too is it was an entirely SEC schedule. Who do we open up with this year? We got FAU out the gate. We got USF after that. And the thing about that, the thing I'm actually really look, USF was terrible objectively this year, but Jeff Scott had them playing in some interesting games late. They nearly knocked off Memphis. They put up 46 on UCF. Jeff Scott, former Clemson OC, co-OC with Tony Elliott, who's being mentioned for the Tennessee job right now. I think he's got that program. I like that hire down here. I'm in the Tampa area, so I follow them a little bit down here. And Florida's come down here week 2. That could be a nice little test for the secondary in week 2, though. Hopefully Florida takes care of business in the game. I'm not like sounding any alarms on it, but in terms of getting a lot of young guys some playing time, maybe even some of those guys are going to redshirt. Hopefully that's one of those games to get onto the field. I think there's going to be more opportunities to get onto the field this year too, and it's not just going to be that entirely all-conference schedule where 2 of our first 3 games out of the gate are Ole Miss, who Lane Kiffin's like dialing it up all year. He threw up almost 50 on Bama too. It wasn't like he just did that to the Gators. And then you got Texas A&M in week 3 who runs all over us. We had some unique challenges too that Grantham faced this year too, that we should also know that it's not going to be quite the same this year. But on the other hand, we are playing Alabama and we are playing LSU and we are playing Georgia, and Florida State comes back on if they decide to get their act together, which they probably won't. But
Vandy's true freshman quarterback who threw for 300 yards on you. You got to face him again too.
Fired up about it. Good opportunity.
Hey, and LSU's true freshman quarterback who threw for 200 yards against it. It's like, look, I appreciate the optimism, Nick. I really do, and I think the defense is going to get better this year. But
it's January, we could be delusional, right?
The lack of ability to stop advanced quarterbacks has always been an issue. In 2018 and 2019, playing against guys who were above average, who had experience, that was sort of the bugaboo for Grantham. I think the only real sort of outlier there was Terry Wilson at Kentucky, and before the knee injury, he looked like he was going to be a really good player. You go to this year, and there's guys who, quite honestly, just weren't very good in SEC play this year, and Florida made them look really good. And at the end of the day, like the sort of thing that always held me out with Grantham is, we may struggle against elite teams, but a lot of people struggle against elite teams, and you don't necessarily have to worry about that true freshman who's coming in is going to light you up and, get nervous in these games where, you really ought to be able to handle your business. In 2020, that just didn't happen. And again, we're talking about an 8-4 team, really an 8-3 team, because they didn't take the Oklahoma game all that seriously. One of those losses is to Alabama. One of those losses is to Texas A&M, who finished top 4 in the country. So the LSU game, again, to go back to what you said, Nick, I think it's a great way to describe it. None of us are over it yet. And that's the one that sticks in our mind as just, sort of the microcosm of the entire year. And, the reality is 8-4 ain't good enough, Florida. And we were 11-1 with a competent defense. And we were probably 10-2 with a defense that wasn't just awful. and the fact that it was so bad, just that's why we were 8-4, and that's why people are frustrated. I get it. I think they'll be better this year, but you squandered the sort of once in a generation offense that you get. I don't know that you're going to get that again in 2021. So we'll have a different set of problems to talk about next year. It'll be we'll be complaining about how they can't convert third downs on the offensive side of the ball, or how they're running the ball too much, or how Hevesy needs to go, or whatever the coach du jour is that we need to get rid of next year. Because watch, Grantham will put up a top 10 defense and the offense won't be able to move the ball.
It is Grantham's last year in his contract. I think we should bring that up. So,
The Bengals could make another run after.
Oh man, yeah. So like I said, there's plenty of names I think you can point to that get you excited. It's just, can you get excited because it starts up top?
Do we think, tying in the last episode, do we think the running game is going to help with the defensive side of the ball this year? Because that could be another thing if I'm trying to be optimistic. If we can run the ball, eat the clock a little more, take longer drives, let the defense get more of a break. Will's already saying no.
Didn't work last year. They had like 7.5 minute drives, come right out, 3 plays, 75 yards, touchdown.
I'm trying over here. I'm trying.
And, I was optimistic all year long, but I was optimistic because I thought there were going to be changes that were made. And that's the thing, right? Is, the entire goal of a college coach is to sell hope to his fan base. And Grantham may turn out to be the right coordinator, the right guy for the job. I don't think so, but he may turn out to be that guy. But you're now going through an entire offseason where half your fan base at least doesn't have a whole lot of hope in the defensive coaching staff because you've retained Grantham. What does that mean? Usually those sorts of things necessitate changes because, your boosters and your season tickets and all that sort of stuff is sort of tied to those sorts of things. But it's interesting. So in 2017, we went through the same thing. I mean, where after 2016, I think a large segment of the fan base wanted Doug Nussmeier gone, and McElwain held on to him, and it turned into a dumpster fire. And so I'm still – somebody coined in 2018 when I was being negative about something that I had McElwain PTSD. I think I still do. I mean, I think I just look back and go, I've seen this movie play on the other side of the ball with an offensive coordinator who was not a difference maker, and in fact was actively bad, not just not a difference maker. He was
a different situation a bit here is you and I went into 2020, there were whispers, in Gator Nation that Todd Grantham was never going to be it. And, you and I kind of were the last to kind of, jump off. Okay, it is time. It is time to move on. We hung on for a little while. From Nussmeier, it was pretty much from the get-go, okay, this isn't going to work. It's a terrible hire. You saw it. You saw it. We were ready to move on pretty early from that hire. But from Grantham, it was 2018, 2019, you can't fire him after that. You just can't. I know some of the fan base wanted him gone. They could forecast 2020 in some kind of way. I don't think anybody forecasted it to be that bad. But, I mean, in 2018, 2019, what he showed, you could not get rid of him after that. There was no way no head coach was going to do that.
No, but that's almost a problem because when he came in 2018 and you looked at his actual statistical profile, you said this guy isn't going to get us to a national championship. Yeah. And so 2018 and 2019 didn't necessarily disprove that. I think it proved exactly what we saw at Georgia, that he can shepherd a good defense. He's not going to shepherd a great defense, and he doesn't make a huge difference in recruiting. Maybe a little bit around the edges, but you get a few more bucks, but good Lord, we've got 75 bucks on the roster. We need a couple of defensive tackles. And that was always the complaint about Muschamp, right? Is that, hey, that's great that you've got all these guys on the defensive side of the ball in the top 10 or top 5 recruiting class, but we might need like 5 offensive linemen. Like that might be something that's required for our team. And so, yeah, I mean, there was no way you were going to get rid of him after those 2 years, and nor do I think you should have. Once you make the decision to hire him, I think that you got to stick with him, especially when the defense improved. I mean, they improved from 2018 to 2019. They were 12th in points per game allowed in 2019. Now, I think they overperformed some of their underlying stats. They were 21st in yards per play allowed, so I think we got a little bit I think they outperformed their underlying statistics, but this year they were 75th in points per game allowed in the country, and that certainly ain't going to get the job done. So, yeah, I mean he's on the hot seat, man, and there's no doubt about it. And I'm interested to see, like you said, is he going to make changes? I don't know. I don't think so because he hasn't really historically. But hey, gotta give him a shot now because you got to ride with him.
We'll just calmly, rationally explained all that, but when we give up, let's say, 35 to USF in week 2, and then we have to play Bama the last week of September before going to LSU, what is going to be the rage level of the fan base with our defense and with Grantham? And Will said it sounds corny, but the whole having hope thing and having some belief in the staff and what they're doing, I think it almost feels like Grantham's a lame duck right now. We're just waiting for that next thing to be outraged by to get rid of him. So that's why I think it's at the point. It's not that the guy can't coach. It's not the guy can't do what he does. Like, he's had a couple good seasons, two good seasons, one bad season here, right? You can argue like the guy can get it done on some level. But if the fan base has lost that faith, and like I said, I think the ultimate thing is it costs you a national title. That's got to be a deal breaker right there. And that's why I think a lot of the faith is gone. But, I mean, hey, on the other hand, if you come out and you deal with FAU the way you should, you deal with USF the way you should, some of those young players step up, play well, we see some pressure off this, maybe we're a little forgiving, and if they come out and have a good performance in the SEC, maybe we're a little forgiving. But, Will, it's January. I'm delusional. I got it.
He's going to have to shut down Bama to win the fan base back over to his side.
Yeah.
Yep. Good luck.
That's all. Just do that.
I mean, that's the reality, right? Is Bama can't score more than 17. I mean, and that's what it's going to come down to. I don't know how likely we think that is. Obviously, Bama's replacing an awful lot too, so maybe they're still sort of finding their way through the season. But they're also replacing everybody who they're losing with like the top 10 recruits from the state of Florida. So
you know, he gets a quarterback that everybody thought would push Mac Jones and Bryce Young. You know, he was supposed to be starting by midseason at Alabama this past year. So
we're replacing our assistants with Urban Meyer's leftovers, and Alabama's replacing their missing assistants with former NFL head coaches, with half of the AFC South.
Okay. Man, I tried to be so excited a little bit here, talking young players anyway. But
hey, I'm excited. You know, here's the thing: is that there were a lot of people at the end of the year who were like, "Oh, was it really a fun season?" and things like that. When you made some remarks at the end and said, "Hey, this is a fun season," like only one team wins the title. And Florida's expectation is to win the title. So we've won 3 in the last, 30 years, 25 years, whatever it is. And so you're going to be disappointed 90% of the time if you're title or bust. So the question is, are you building in the right way? Is your process right? And that sort of thing. And that's why the Grantham retention, I think, rubs people the wrong way, is because it strikes of a patience that most of us don't have with this particular coordinator. But I'm willing, you know, one of the things that I think has been interesting about recruiting is I think Mullen needs to recruit at a higher level in order to win consistently in the SEC. I think that's what the history says, but he's also winning at a level above where you would expect him to win based on the level of recruiting that he's had in this particular conference. So I'm willing to admit that I'm at least partially wrong when it comes to the recruiting aspect and Mullen, because I would have expected him to probably take a little bit more of a step back this year based on some of the recruiting. They've been able to plug some of the holes with transfers, and they're going to have an opportunity to do it again this year. So, you know, hey, I'm willing to entertain the fact that his process of being patient with his assistant coaches pays off in the long term, and maybe he can get Grantham to change some things because he's bought into because he's got guys who know he's got their back. Right. And that the coach would say, nah, if I'm going down with the ship, you know, if I'm not going down with the ship, I'm going down my way. And so I'm not going to change. Maybe the fact that Mullen's sort of putting his neck out there for Grantham makes Grantham take a step back and say, okay, there are probably some things we can change. I think that's probably the best case scenario, is that the process that Mullen's implementing of being patient with his coordinators and with his assistants pays off in that way, that they reward his loyalty by being willing to listen. When, I mean, a guy who's clearly an outstanding football coach in Dan Mullen, who should be able to help a defensive coordinator get better, says something, hopefully they'll listen because of that loyalty.
All right. Well said. Well, guys, reading reaction, what you got coming up this week, Will?
Yeah, so we actually just dropped another podcast for the 2020 hindsight, Ohio State versus Miami in the 2003 Fiesta Bowl. So Nick is an Ohio State homer, so it was a really excruciating podcast to listen to because he grew up in Columbus, and so, you know, for some reason he doesn't think that's pass interference in overtime against Miami there. But yeah, so we got that going at 2020 hindsight. You can find that on iTunes or at the Read and Reaction YouTube site. And then
Bill Sykes was back on Read Reaction.
Yeah, then we had Billy back. He was writing about all SEC. And actually, so his was a really cool article looking at DBU, or looking at blank U, right? So who's QBU, who's RBU in the SEC based on all SEC play. And then Nick wrote something about Tennessee earlier in this week. Just go for the picture that he photoshopped of Phil Fulmer on the body of Grimace from McDonald's, because you know, so he sort of matched all of the all of the fast food joints with different SEC programs. So that was sort of entertaining. Nick, what were some of the better ones? I liked the Popeyes.
Popeyes, yeah. LSU was Popeyes because in 2019, we thought there was a chance in 2019 that they could become the king of the chicken sandwich, but it turns out they didn't stock their inventory all that well, and they had to reshuffle. And by the time they get their mojo back, Chick-fil-A is back on top. So we know that. Alabama obviously being Chick-fil-A. Georgia's Zaxby's pretty good, but not Chick-fil-A good. So it's like it's the different bags that all the programs would use to pass out to their recruits. So Kentucky uses KFC because they care more about buckets than anything else. So, but yeah, on American football stories, we're focused still on the NFL a little bit, so we're mostly just covering the championship games going into the Super Bowl. And then so I didn't mention my co-host's name last week. I feel bad about that, but Robert Parker, doing that with my co-host Robert Parker, and we'll have some Super Bowl coverage in the next week. But then it's going to turn to recruiting, and we're going to get heavy into college football coverage going forward.
Awesome. Good stuff, guys. Nick, man, thanks for hopping on the last couple of weeks and giving us a preview of these 2021 Gators, both sides of the ball there. And good stuff, man. Good stuff.
Had a great time. I'll be on anytime you call, Dave. Thanks a lot.
Good. Sounds good. That's Nick Knudsen. You can find him at American Football Stories. Nick, what's your Twitter handle out there so people can know?
It's at Nick Knudsen FB, KNUDSEN, at Nick Knudsen FB.
All right. And for Will Miles, you can find him at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.